Welcome to this video tutorial on positioning. My name's Anthony, and in this video we'll be looking at everything you need to know about positioning your objects in FixFlow. There are two types of positioning in FixFlow, absolute and relative. Absolute is where the element is positioned absolutely to its parents. This can be thought of as a fixed position. And here an element will be taken out of the flow, and we'll see some examples of this later. This kind of positioning can be useful for things like logos if you always want them to appear in the top left hand corner. Relative positioning, on the other hand, here the element is positioned relative to its normal position and its siblings. Design can be thought of as flowing or flexing on the screen. An example use case is where we apply flexible layouts to elements that will be used to create a responsive application. So let's take a look at this in practice. Here we have a dashboard that contains 5 coloured areas. Let's apply some absolute positioning to this end area. The way that we do that is to select it to open up its properties. And if we scroll down to the position settings, we can actually set exactly where this area will appear. Now, by applying these absolute position settings, the area has been taken out of the flow and moved to the top left-hand side. Now, the reason this is important to know is that you can see that the size of the object has now changed, and that's because it was previously being influenced by its parent, and we'll look at that more when we look at Flexbox. Absolute positioning can also be applied via the shared styles and also in the CSS properties. Now let's look at relative styling. Here I've removed some of the styling that was influencing the coloured areas that we had, so we can see what happens by default in FixFlow. Here our 5 areas have been laid out, and they're relative to each other, and each one starts on a new line. If I was to remove one of these areas, we can see that the areas have shifted up because they're now moving relative to the parent. We can influence the way that these objects flow, and in this instance we'll look at how I use Flexbox to control how these objects lay out. For example, if we select the parent area and look at its properties, we can scroll down until we get to this direction section. Now what this allows us to do is apply something called Flexbox, and we'll look at this in more detail in a specific video, but we'll cover some of the high level concepts of it in this video. So what Flexbox allows us to do is actually set how our areas will lay out, and this will control the children inside it. So for example here, if I set this to row, we'll set the wrap to wrap, justify to flex start, and align to stretch, and we'll explain how these work in a moment or two. Now by saving that, what we can see is that our areas have been aligned in a row. If we ran out of space in the row, then the wrap would start as a new row. The justify means that we start on the left, that's the flex start, and the align stretch is stretching those areas to take up the available space. So we can see here that the parent can have quite an influence on the child objects. So the benefit of the relative layout is that objects will now respond. So we saw here that we've got our wrap set. So when we run out of space on a row, our objects will wrap around. So we'll see that here now when I resize this window. We can see our areas are wrapping to accommodate the space available on the screen. Now if we want to see that in a more practical example, let's take a look at the demonstration dashboard that's provided in Theme 2. Here we can see we have 4 tiles laid out next to each other. Now styling is influencing the size and proportions of these, but we can see if we were to resize this window, that our tiles move to accommodate the space available on the screen. This is particularly useful for when you're creating applications that need to be responsive. So for example, you may want it to be viewed on a mobile phone or tablet PC. Now one thing to remember is that if we apply any absolute positioning to a particular area, it will take it out of that flow, out of the Flexbox control. So let's select our first area, scroll down, and if we apply some absolute positioning to the top left, what we can see here is that area 1 has been taken out of the flow, put in an absolute position, and the other areas have now been placed on top of it. If we want area 1 to be at the front, then what we can do is use something called zindex, and this controls the depth at which an object is placed. So if I set this to 10, what this will do is it will bring it to the front of the screen, and that's because by default the z-index is 1. I like to use increments of 10 when I'm setting up my z-indexes, just in case I need to insert something in between 2 objects. And that brings us to the end of this video on positioning. I hope you found it useful, and thank you for watching.